Elijah had spent 10 years praying for Winona to return, and the moment she stepped off that stagecoach, his whole body went cold. His wife Martha was expecting him home for dinner. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Cedar Hollow when Elijah Cole first saw her again. 10 years had passed since the night she vanished into the darkness beyond his ranch, leaving nothing behind but the turquoise beads he still kept in his shirt pocket, worn smooth from a decade of desperate hope. He had been loading supplies into his wagon outside the mercantile when the stagecoach rolled in, and something made him look up at precisely the wrong moment. There she was, stepping down from the coach like a vision summoned from the deepest recesses of his memory. Winona. Her dark hair still fell in thick braids past her shoulders, and she still wore the traditional dress of her mother's people, though there was something different about her now. A heaviness in her eyes that had not been there when she was 19 and he was 22, when they had whispered promises to each other beneath the cottonwood trees by the river. She had not seen him yet, and for one wild moment, Elijah considered turning away, climbing into his wagon, and driving home to the woman who waited for him there. The woman who had become his wife 3 years ago, who had given him stability and companionship when he had finally accepted that Winona was never coming back. But his boots remained rooted to the wooden boardwalk, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged animal desperate for freedom. Winona turned, and their eyes met across the dusty street. Time seemed to collapse in on itself, folding 10 years of separation into a single breathless moment. He watched recognition dawn on her face, watched the color drain from her sun-kissed cheeks, watched her lips part as if to speak, though no words emerged. The noise of the town faded to nothing. The shopkeepers calling their wares, the children playing in the street, the horses snorting and stamping, all of it disappeared until there was only Winona, standing 20 feet away, looking at him as if she had seen a ghost. Perhaps she had. Perhaps he was a ghost to her now, a remnant of a life she had left behind when her father's people called her back to the reservation, when duty and blood proved stronger than love. He had begged her not to go, had gotten down on his knees in the dirt outside his cabin and pleaded with her to stay, to marry him, to build a life together on the land he was slowly carving from the wilderness. But she had touched his face with gentle hands and told him that some bonds could not be broken, that her grandmother was dying, and her presence was required for ceremonies he could never understand, that she would return to him when her obligations were fulfilled. She had promised, and he had believed her. The first year, he had waited with patient certainty. She would come back with the spring thaw, he told himself, when the mountain passes cleared and travel became possible again. But spring came and went, and summer burned hot and dry, and autumn painted the hills in gold and crimson, and still there was no word from Winona. The second year, his certainty curdled into anxiety. He wrote letters to the reservation, though he was never sure they reached her. He rode 3 days to speak with the Indian agent, who told him that tribal matters were not his concern, and that he should forget about the native girl and find himself a proper wife. The third year, anxiety gave way to grief. Something must have happened to her. Illness or accident or worse. No other explanation made sense for why she would abandon the love they had shared, the future they had planned. He mourned her as if she had died, wearing his sorrow like a second skin that he could never quite shed. By the 5th year, grief had hardened into a kind of numb acceptance. Life on the frontier did not allow for prolonged mourning. There were cattle to tend and fences to mend and crops to plant. The ranch demanded his attention, and slowly, reluctantly, he began to give it. The turquoise beads remained in his pocket, a talisman of what had been and what might have been, but he stopped taking them out to look at them every night before sleep. The 7th year brought Martha. She had come to Cedar Hollow as a schoolteacher, a practical woman from back east who had lost her fiancé to consumption and sought a fresh start in the territories. She was not beautiful in the way that Winona was beautiful. Her features were plain, her hair a mousy brown that she kept pinned in a severe bun, her dresses sensible and modest, but she was kind, and she was steady, and when she looked at Elijah, she saw the man he had become rather than the ghost he was still chasing. Their courtship was nothing like his wild passion with Winona. There were no stolen kisses beneath the stars, no whispered promises of forever, no desperate certainty that they had found the other half of their souls. Instead, there were quiet conversations on the porch of the boarding house where Martha lived, shared meals at the town diner, and slow walks along the river where Elijah carefully avoided the cottonwood grove that held too many memories. Martha knew about Winona. The whole town knew, in the way that small towns always knew everyone's business. She never asked him to forget his first love, never demanded that he remove the beads from his pocket or stop visiting the grove on the anniversary of Winona's departure. She simply offered him her steady presence and her practical affection, and in time he came to appreciate the gift she was giving him. They married in the spring of his 32nd year, a simple ceremony at the church with half the town in attendance. Martha wore a blue dress that brought out the warmth in her gray eyes, and when Elijah slipped the ring onto her finger, he told himself that this was enough. That comfort and companionship were more than many men ever found, and that the passionate love of his youth had been a fever dream that he was finally recovering from. 3 years of marriage had followed, years that were neither happy nor unhappy, but simply steady. Martha kept his house with quiet efficiency, prepared his meals, mended his clothes. They shared a bed but not their souls, existing in the same space without ever quite touching at the deepest level. And every night before Elijah fell asleep, his hand would drift unconsciously to his shirt pocket, finding the familiar shape of the turquoise beads, and he would wonder where Winona was and whether she ever thought of him. Now she was here, standing in the street of Cedar Hollow, and all the careful peace he had constructed over the past decade was crumbling like a dam before a flood. He should speak. He should walk toward her, say something civilized and distant, treat her as what she was, a woman from his past who had no place in his present. But his tongue felt thick in his mouth, and his feet remained stubbornly planted, and all he could do was stare at the face that had haunted his dreams for 10 long years. It was Winona who moved first. She crossed the distance between them with the fluid grace he remembered, her moccasined feet making no sound on the dusty street. When she stopped before him, close enough that he could smell the sage and sweetgrass in her hair, her dark eyes were bright with unshed tears. Elijah. His name on her lips was both a blessing and a curse. Winona. He managed, his voice rougher than he intended. You came back. I came back, she repeated, and something in her voice broke on the words. She reached up as if to touch his face, then seemed to remember where they were and let her hand fall back to her side. The gesture sent a lance of pain through Elijah's chest, sharp and unexpected after so many years of carefully cultivated numbness. Around them, the town was beginning to take notice. He could feel the weight of curious stares, hear the whispers starting to spread like wildfire through dry grass. The native woman who had left Elijah Cole all those years ago had returned, and everyone wanted to see what would happen next. He should step back. He should put distance between them, both physical and emotional. And he should remember that he was a married man now, that Martha was waiting for him at home, that the life he had built in Winona's absence could not simply be dismantled because she had finally decided to return. But his body refused to obey his mind's commands. Instead, he found himself drinking in the sight of her like a man dying of thirst, cataloging all the ways she had changed and all the ways she had remained exactly the same. The years had carved fine lines at the corners of her eyes, traces of laughter or sorrow or both. Her cheekbones seemed sharper now, more pronounced, as if life had stripped away everything soft and left only the essential structure beneath. She wore more jewelry than he remembered, layers of turquoise and silver that caught the morning light, and there was a medicine bag hanging from a cord around her neck that he had never seen before. But her eyes were the same deep brown that had captivated him when he was barely more than a boy, and when she looked at him, he felt the same vertiginous sensation of falling that had marked the beginning of their love. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "There is much I need to explain." Her English was more formal than it had been, each word carefully pronounced, as if she had been speaking her mother's tongue exclusively and had to remember how to shape these foreign sounds. 10 years, Winona. He heard the accusation in his own voice and could not soften it. 10 years without a word, and now you appear wanting to talk. I know. She lowered her gaze, and he saw shame flicker across her features. I know what I did to you, Elijah. I have carried the weight of it every day since I left. But there were reasons, circumstances you could not have understood. Try me. The words came out harsher than he intended, but he could not find it in himself to regret them. Not here, she said, glancing around at the growing crowd of onlookers. Please, is there somewhere private we can go? Every instinct screamed at him to refuse, to walk away, to protect the fragile stability of his current life from the chaos this woman represented. But the turquoise beads in his pocket seemed to burn against his chest, and the part of him that had never stopped loving her, the part he had tried so desperately to bury, would not let him turn his back on her now. There is a grove by the river, he said, hating himself even as the words left his mouth. You remember the place? Her sharp intake of breath told him that she did. The Cottonwood Grove, their place, where they had first kissed, first made love, first promised themselves to each other in words that had felt more binding than any ceremony. He collected his wagon and helped her onto the seat beside him, ignoring the scandalized whispers that followed them down the street. Let them talk, let them. They would talk regardless of what he did, and at least this way he might finally get the answers that had eluded him for a decade. The ride to the grove took 20 minutes. 20 minutes of silence broken only by the creak of wagon wheels and the rhythmic clopping of his horse's hooves. Winona sat rigid beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She seemed smaller than he remembered, diminished somehow, though whether by time or circumstance he could not say. When they reached the grove, the cottonwoods were in full leaf, their branches creating a canopy of dappled green light that filtered down to the grass below. The river murmured nearby, the same eternal song it had sung when they were young and foolish and convinced that love could conquer all obstacles. Elijah helped Winona down from the wagon, and for a moment their hands clasped, his rough and calloused from years of ranch work, hers surprisingly soft, despite the hardships he imagined she must have faced. They walked to the riverbank without speaking, to the exact spot where he had asked her to be his wife all those years ago. She had said yes with tears streaming down her face, had thrown herself into his arms with such abandon that they had both tumbled into the shallow water, laughing and kissing and believing that nothing could ever tear them apart. Now they stood apart, a careful distance between them, the ghosts of their younger selves hovering in the air like morning mist. Tell me, Elijah said. Tell me why you left and why you never came back. Winona was quiet for a long moment, her gaze fixed on the flowing water. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. My grandmother was dying. You knew that much? I had to be there for the ceremonies, for the passing of knowledge that could only happen at such times. But what you did not know, what I could not tell you, was that my father had made arrangements while I was away. Arrangements for what? She turned to face him, and he saw the tears she had been holding back finally spill down her cheeks. He had promised me to another man, a warrior from our tribe, a man of importance and influence. When I returned to the reservation, I learned that the wedding had already been negotiated, that refusing would bring shame upon my entire family and jeopardize my people's standing with the tribal council. The words hit him like physical blows, each one driving deeper than the last. You were married to someone else. For 10 years, while I waited for you, you belonged to another man. Yes. The single syllable carried the weight of a decade's worth of guilt and sorrow. His name was Running Bear, and he was not unkind, but he was not you. He could never be you. Elijah turned away, unable to look at her, unable to process the magnitude of what she was telling him. And now? Where is this husband of yours now? He is dead. Her voice cracked on the word. He died 6 months ago, from the sickness that swept through the reservation. And when the mourning period ended, I knew I had to find you. I had to explain, to beg your forgiveness, to see if there was any chance that what we had could be recovered. She stepped closer, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her body despite the space between them. I never stopped loving you, Elijah. Not for a single day. He should tell her now. He should say the words that would shatter whatever hope she carried in her heart, the words that would explain why reconciliation was impossible no matter how much they might both wish otherwise. But when he opened his mouth, what came out was not the truth about Martha, about his marriage, about the life he had built in her absence. Instead of confessing the truth, Elijah found himself pulling her into his arms, crushing her against his chest as if he could somehow absorb her into himself and undo all the years of separation. She came willingly, her body molding to his with the familiarity of muscle memory, her arms wrapping around his waist as sobs shook her slender frame. They stood like that for what felt like hours, two broken people clinging to each other in the ruins of what might have been. The scent of her filled his nostrils, sage and sweetgrass and something uniquely Winona, a smell he had tried and failed to forget for a decade. Her tears soaked through his shirt, warm against his skin, and he found his own eyes burning with emotions he had thought long buried. This was wrong. He knew it was wrong with every rational part of his mind. But the heart that had never truly healed, the heart that still belonged to this woman despite everything, did not care about right or wrong. It only cared that she was finally here, finally in his arms, finally close enough to touch after 10 years of aching absence. When she finally pulled back, her face was streaked with tears, but there was hope shining in her dark eyes, a hope that made his stomach clench with guilt for what he had not yet told her. Elijah, she breathed, reaching up to cup his face in her hands. Tell me it is not too late for us. Tell me we can start again. He should speak now. The words were right there, pressing against his lips, demanding to be released. Martha, wife, marriage. 3 simple words that would explain everything and destroy this fragile moment forever. But looking into Winona's eyes, seeing the love that had somehow survived a decade of separation and a marriage to another man, he found himself unable to shatter her hope so brutally. There are things I need to tell you, he said instead, hating his own cowardice. Things have changed since you left. Of course they have changed. She smiled through her tears, a smile that pierced his heart with its trembling vulnerability. We have both changed. But the love between us, that has not changed. I can feel it. Can you not feel it too? God help him, he could. Despite everything, despite Martha, despite 3 years of marriage and the vows he had spoken before God and the community, he could feel the same inexorable pull toward Winona that had defined his youth. It was as if the years apart had been merely a pause, an interruption in a story that was always meant to continue. But stories did not exist in isolation. There were other characters now, other hearts that would be wounded by this particular narrative. "Winona," he began, but she silenced him with a finger pressed gently to his lips. "Not yet," she said. "Before you tell me whatever it is that weighs so heavily upon you, let me have this moment. Let me remember what it felt like to be held by you, to believe that everything would be all right as long as we were together." He should insist. He should pull away, create distance, force the truth into the space between them. Instead, he lowered his head and kissed her. The kiss was everything he remembered and more. Soft at first, tentative, as if they were both afraid of what they might unleash. Then deeper, more desperate, 10 years of longing and loss pouring into the press of lips and the tangle of tongues. His hands found her waist, her shoulders, the thick silk of her braids. Her fingers clutched at his shirt, pulling him closer, as if she feared he might disappear if she loosened her grip even slightly. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the world seemed to have shifted on its axis. Nothing looked quite the same as it had before. The cottonwood leaves whispered secrets in the breeze. The river sang a different song, and the sunlight filtering through the branches seemed to carry a golden promise of redemption. "I have dreamed of this," Winona whispered, her forehead resting against his. "Every night for 10 years I have dreamed of finding my way back to you." Her words were a knife twisting in his gut. He had dreamed of her too, dreams that left him waking in the darkness beside Martha, his heart racing and his pillow damp with tears he refused to acknowledge. But dreams were not reality, and reality had a way of intruding no matter how desperately one wished to keep it at bay. "We should go back to town," he said, his voice rough. "There is a boarding house where you can stay until we figure out what happens next. What happens next is that we are together." Her certainty was absolute, unshakable. "I did not travel all this way, did not endure all that I have endured, to lose you again." There was a fire in her eyes now, the same fierce determination he remembered from their youth. Winona had always been strong, stronger than him in many ways, with a will that bent but never broke. It was one of the things he had loved most about her, and one of the things that had made her absence so devastating. A woman like that did not simply vanish without reason. "There is something I must tell you," he said, the words finally forcing their way past the barrier of his cowardice. "Something that changes everything." Her expression shifted, wariness creeping into the hope. "What is it?" Before he could answer, the sound of an approaching wagon reached their ears. They both turned toward the road, and Elijah felt his blood run cold as he recognized the horse, the wagon, the figure holding the reins. Martha. His wife had come looking for him, as she sometimes did when he was late returning from town. She must have asked at the mercantile where he had gone, must have been told about the native woman who had arrived on the stagecoach and the way Elijah had left town with her in his wagon. The look on her face as she brought the wagon to a stop at the edge of the grove told him that she understood exactly what she had interrupted. There was no surprise in her gray eyes, only a weary resignation that suggested she had been expecting this moment since the day she agreed to marry him. "Martha," he said, stepping away from Winona, his voice carrying the desperate tone of a man caught in an act of betrayal. "I can explain. Can you?" His wife's voice was calm, eerily so, as she climbed down from the wagon seat. She smoothed her practical brown dress with hands that trembled only slightly, then turned to face the woman who had haunted her marriage from its very beginning. "So you are Winona." Her gaze traveled over the other woman, taking in the traditional dress, the turquoise jewelry, the dark beauty that Martha knew she could never rival. "I have heard a great deal about you over the years." Winona's eyes had gone wide with shock, darting between Elijah and Martha as understanding dawned. She took a step backward, then another, her hand rising to press against her chest as if to contain a heart that was suddenly breaking. "Elijah," she breathed, her voice barely audible. "Who is this woman?" He closed his eyes, unable to face either of them as he spoke the words that would shatter one life or the other, possibly both. "Winona, this is Martha. She is my wife." The silence that followed his confession seemed to stretch into eternity. Winona stood frozen, her face a mask of shock and disbelief, while Martha remained perfectly still beside her wagon, her expression unreadable. Elijah felt as if he were being torn in two, the weight of both women's gazes pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. It was Winona who broke the silence first, a sound escaping her lips that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "Your wife," she repeated, the words seeming to taste like poison on her tongue. "You are married." 3 years now," Martha said quietly, stepping forward with a dignity that made Elijah feel even smaller than he already did. "We wed in the spring, in the church in town. It was a lovely ceremony. There was no malice in her voice, no accusation, just a simple statement of fact that somehow cut deeper than any recrimination could have." Winona turned to Elijah, her dark eyes blazing with a pain that made him want to fall to his knees and beg forgiveness. "You kissed me," she said, her voice trembling with barely contained fury. "Just now, knowing you belonged to another woman, you kissed me." "I know." The words were wholly inadequate, but they were all he had. "I should have told you immediately. I should never have brought you here, never touched you, never let you believe that we could simply pick up where we left off. But when I saw you step off that stagecoach, when you looked at me with those eyes, it was as if the past 10 years had never happened, as if Martha had never happened." He turned to his wife, shame burning in his chest. "That is no excuse. I know there is no excuse for what I have done." Martha's expression flickered, something that might have been pain passing briefly across her features before she composed herself again. "No," she agreed softly. "There is no excuse. But there is perhaps an explanation." She turned to Winona, and Elijah watched as something passed between the two women, a recognition of shared circumstance that transcended the rivalry their situation might suggest. "I knew when I married him that his heart belonged to someone else. He never lied to me about that. I thought that time would change things, that eventually the ghost of you would fade and he would learn to love me the way he loved you." "And did he?" Winona's voice was barely a whisper. "Did he learn to love you?" Martha was quiet for a long moment, her gaze dropping to study the grass at her feet. "He learned to care for me," she said finally. "He learned to be a good husband in all the ways that matter, providing for me, treating me with kindness and respect, building a life with me that was comfortable if not passionate. But love?" She shook her head slowly. "No, I do not think he ever truly loved me. Not the way he loves you." The honesty of the admission seemed to shock all three of them. Elijah stared at his wife, seeing her perhaps for the first time since their wedding day, not as a replacement for Winona, not as a practical solution to his loneliness, but as a woman in her own right, a woman who had entered their marriage with open eyes and a hopeful heart, only to watch that hope slowly wither in the shadow of another woman's memory. "Martha," he began, but she held up a hand to silence him. "I did not come here to make accusations or to cause a scene," she said, her voice steady, despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I came because I needed to see for myself. I needed to know if the woman you have been carrying in your heart all these years was real, or just a fantasy you constructed to avoid truly committing to our marriage." She looked at Winona with something that might have been understanding. "Now I have my answer." Winona seemed to shrink under Martha's gaze, the fire of her earlier anger giving way to something more complex. "I did not know," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "When I came here, when I found him, I did not know he had married. I would never have kissed him, would never have spoken of starting again if I had known he belonged to another. "I believe you," Martha replied simply. And strangely enough, Elijah could see that she meant it. Some understanding had formed between these two women, a recognition of each other's pain that seemed to transcend the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. The three of them stood in the dappled sunlight of the cottonwood grove, a triangle of heartbreak and complicated emotions that defied easy resolution. Elijah looked from one woman to the other, the woman he had married and the woman he had never stopped loving, and felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down upon his shoulders. "What happens now?" he asked, the question directed at both of them and neither. "What are we supposed to do?" Martha straightened her spine, squaring her shoulders in a gesture Elijah had come to recognize over 3 years of marriage. It meant she had made a decision, had found her footing in uncertain terrain. "What happens now is that we return to town," she said firmly. "All three of us. We will not resolve this standing in a grove full of memories that do not include me." She turned to Winona, and her voice softened slightly. "You will need a place to stay. The boarding house has rooms available. I suggest you take one and give us all time to think about what comes next." It was such a practical suggestion, so utterly Martha, that Elijah almost smiled despite the gravity of the situation. His wife had always been the sensible one, the steady presence that kept their household running smoothly, while he lost himself in ranch work and memories of another woman. She deserved better than what he had given her. They both deserved better. Winona nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "You are more gracious than I would be in your position," she said quietly. "I do not know if I could face a rival with such composure." "We are not rivals," Martha replied, and there was something almost gentle in her voice. "We are two women who love the same man, caught in circumstances none of us chose. There will be time enough for anger and recrimination later. For now, let us simply get through this day." They rode back to town in silence, Martha and Elijah in one wagon, Winona following in the one Elijah had brought her in. The arrangement felt symbolic somehow, a physical representation of the divide that had opened between them. The boarding house in Cedar Hollow was a modest establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Pearson, a sharp-eyed woman who had seen enough of frontier life to know when questions should not be asked. She took one look at Winona, glanced at Elijah and Martha standing awkwardly behind her, and simply nodded before leading the native woman upstairs to a clean room with a view of the mountains. "I will bring you supper later," she said, her voice carrying no judgment. "Rest now. You look like you have traveled a long way." Elijah watched Winona disappear up the stairs, her shoulders bowed with exhaustion and heartbreak, and felt something inside him crack. He had done this to her. His cowardice in the grove, his inability to speak the truth when it mattered most, had given her false hope only to snatch it away in the cruelest possible fashion. Whatever happened next, he would carry the guilt of that moment for the rest of his life. Martha touched his arm gently, drawing his attention back to the present. "We should go home," she said quietly. "There is nothing more to be done here today." The ride back to their ranch was conducted in the same heavy silence that had characterized the journey from the grove. Elijah kept stealing glances at his wife, trying to read her expression, but Martha's face remained a careful mask of composure. Only her hands, gripping the reins with white-knuckled intensity, betrayed the turmoil beneath the surface. When they finally reached the house, she climbed down from the wagon without waiting for his assistance and walked inside without looking back. Elijah tended to the horses mechanically, his mind churning with thoughts he could not organize into any coherent pattern. When he finally entered the house, he found Martha standing at the kitchen stove, preparing dinner as if this were any ordinary evening. The normalcy of the scene felt almost surreal after the upheaval of the day. "Martha," he said, hovering in the doorway, We need to talk about what happened. Do we? She did not turn around, her attention fixed on the pot she was stirring. It seems fairly straightforward to me. The woman you love has returned, and now you must decide what you want to do about it. The bluntness of her words struck him like a physical blow. He had expected tears, accusations, demands for explanations. This calm acceptance was somehow worse, suggesting a resignation that had been building long before Winona's arrival. "I made vows to you," he said, moving into the kitchen. "Before God and the community, I promised to be your husband. Those vows meant something to me." Did they? She finally turned to face him, and he saw the tears she had been hiding streaking silently down her cheeks. Or were they simply words you spoke because you had given up hope of ever seeing her again? "I was a consolation prize, Elijah. We both know that. I accepted it because I thought half of your heart was better than none at all. But now she is here, and I see the way you look at her, and I realize that I never had even half. I had whatever scraps were left over after she took everything that mattered." The accusation was devastating precisely because it was true. He wanted to deny it, to insist that he had genuinely cared for Martha, that their marriage had meant something real. But the words stuck in his throat because they would be lies, and Martha deserved better than more lies. "I never meant to hurt you," he said instead, the words sounding hollow even to his own ears. "I know you did not," she replied, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "That almost makes it worse. If you had been cruel, if you had treated me badly, I could hate you. But you were kind, Elijah. You were gentle and considerate, and everything a husband should be, except present. Your body was here with me, but your heart was always somewhere else, waiting for a woman who might never return." She turned back to the stove, her shoulders shaking slightly. "And now she has returned, and I do not know where that leaves me." Elijah moved to stand behind her, close enough to touch but not quite making contact. "Where do you want it to leave you?" he asked quietly. "What do you want to happen?" She was silent for a long moment, the only sound the bubbling of the pot and the distant lowing of cattle outside. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I want you to love me the way you love her, but we both know that is not possible. So I suppose the question is not what I want, but what I can live with." "What do you mean?" She turned again, and this time there was something different in her expression, a resolve forming beneath the pain. "I mean that I have spent 3 years pretending that this marriage was enough for me," she said slowly, "telling myself that comfort and security were worth more than passion, that being cared for was almost as good as being loved. But seeing you with her today, seeing the way your whole being came alive in her presence, I realized that I have been lying to myself. You deserve more than what I can give you," Elijah said, the admission tearing itself from somewhere deep in his chest. "You deserve a man who looks at you the way I look at her." "Yes," Martha agreed simply. "I do. But I also made vows, and I take them seriously, even if you do not. I will not simply walk away from this marriage because it has become inconvenient." She straightened her spine, that familiar gesture of determination. "But neither will I continue to pretend that everything is fine. If we are going to move forward, whatever that looks like, we need to be honest with each other. Starting now." The challenge hung in the air between them, demanding a response. Elijah felt the weight of 2 women's expectations pressing down on him, Martha here in front of him and Winona somewhere in town, both waiting to learn what kind of man he truly was. "You are right," he said finally. "We have not been honest with each other, and that is my fault. I should have told you about the beads in my pocket, about the dreams that woke me in the night, about how I went to the cottonwood grove every year on the anniversary of her leaving. I should have trusted you with my grief instead of hiding it away. And I should have demanded that honesty from the beginning," Martha replied. instead of accepting the surface of our marriage and pretending not to see the cracks beneath. She reached out and took his hand, her grip firm despite the trembling of her fingers. So let us start now. Tell me truly, Elijah, now that she has returned, now that you have held her in your arms again, what do you want? The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, demanding an answer that Elijah was not certain he could give. What did he want? For 10 years, he had wanted only one thing: Winona's return. Every prayer whispered in the darkness, every wish made on falling stars, every desperate hope had been directed toward that single impossible outcome. And now it had happened, and he discovered that wanting something and knowing what to do with it were entirely different matters. "I want to stop hurting people," he said finally, the words inadequate but honest. "I want to find a way through this that does not leave destruction in its wake, but I do not know if such a path exists." Martha released his hand and turned back to her cooking, her movements mechanical and precise. "That is not an answer," she said quietly. "That is an avoidance. Tell me what you truly want, even if it wounds me. I would rather have truth that cuts than kindness that deceives." He watched her back, the rigid set of her shoulders, the careful way she held herself together despite the earthquake that had struck their lives. "I want her," he admitted, and the words felt like betrayal, even as they brought relief. "I have never stopped wanting her, never stopped loving her, despite everything I told myself over the years. When I saw her step off that stagecoach, it was as if a piece of my soul that had been missing suddenly returned." Martha's stirring faltered for just a moment before resuming its steady rhythm. "And what about me?" she asked, her voice carefully neutral. "What do you want from me?" "I want you to be happy," he said, moving to stand beside her at the stove. "I know that sounds hollow given everything I have just confessed, but it is true. You have been a good wife to me, Martha. You deserved a husband who could give you his whole heart, not just the broken pieces left behind by another woman." She set down her spoon and turned to face him, her gray eyes searching his face for something he was not sure he could provide. "And if my happiness means releasing you from this marriage?" she asked. "If I were to say that I would rather be alone than continue living with a man who loves someone else?" The question struck him with unexpected force. He had been so focused on his own torn loyalties that he had not fully considered what Martha might want, what choices she might make now that the truth was finally out in the open. "Is that what you want?" he asked carefully. "To end our marriage?" "I do not know what I want," she admitted, and for the first time since Winona's arrival, he saw the full depth of her pain. "I have spent 3 years building a life with you, making this house a home, believing that eventually your heart would turn toward me. Now I learn that it never will, that I have been competing with a ghost who has suddenly become flesh and blood. How am I supposed to know what I want when everything I thought I understood has been overturned?" They stood in the kitchen as evening shadows lengthened across the floor, two people bound by vows and circumstance, trying to find their way through a situation that had no easy resolution. The pot on the stove began to boil over, and Martha turned to tend it with hands that shook despite her best efforts at composure. "Eat something," she said, ladling stew into bowls with mechanical precision. "Whatever we decide, we will need our strength to face it." They sat across from each other at the table where they had shared hundreds of meals, but this time the silence between them was different. It was not the comfortable quiet of a settled marriage, but the heavy stillness of two people waiting for something to break. Elijah forced himself to eat, tasting nothing, his mind churning with impossible choices. After dinner, Martha retreated to the parlor with her sewing basket, and Elijah found himself standing on the porch staring out at the darkening prairie. The stars were beginning to emerge, the same stars he had wished upon for 10 years, begging the universe to bring Winona back to him. Now his wish had been granted, and he discovered that answered prayers could be as devastating as unanswered ones. He did not know how long he stood there before he heard the sound of approaching hooves. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle by the door, a reflex born of years on the frontier where unexpected visitors after dark were rarely welcome. But as the rider drew closer, he recognized the figure silhouetted against the rising moon. Winona. She rode one of the livery horses, her braids streaming behind her, her face pale and determined in the starlight. Elijah moved to meet her as she dismounted, his heart hammering against his ribs. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "You should be resting at the boarding house." "I could not stay there," she replied, her dark eyes searching his face. "I could not lie in that room staring at the ceiling while everything between us remained unresolved. I need to know, Elijah. I need to know if there is any hope for us, or if I should leave Cedar Hollow and never look back." He glanced toward the house where lamplight glowed warmly in the windows. Martha was inside, perhaps watching them through the curtains, perhaps lost in her own thoughts. Either way, she deserved to be part of this conversation. "Wait here," he said quietly. "There is something I need to do." He returned to the house and found Martha exactly where he expected, standing at the window with her sewing forgotten in her hands. "She is here," Martha said, a statement rather than a question. "Yes." He moved to stand beside her, looking out at Winona's silhouette in the moonlight. "She wants to know if there is hope for us. She wants to know if she should stay or go." "And what did you tell her?" "I told her to wait. Because whatever is decided tonight affects all three of us, and you deserve a voice in that decision." Martha turned to look at him, something shifting in her expression. "That is the first time in our marriage that you have truly included me," she said softly. "The first time you have treated me as a partner rather than an obligation." The observation cut deep because it was true. For 3 years, he had gone through the motions of marriage while keeping his true self locked away, protecting his grief and his memories from the woman who shared his bed. Martha set down her sewing and smoothed the front of her dress with deliberate care. "Then let us go speak with her together," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "If we are to decide our futures, we should at least have the courage to do it face to face." They walked out onto the porch together, husband and wife presenting a united front to the woman who threatened to tear them apart. Winona stood by her horse, her posture tense, her eyes darting between them as they approached. The moonlight cast silver shadows across her face, highlighting the sharp planes of her cheekbones and the uncertainty in her expression. "I did not mean to intrude," she said, her voice barely carrying across the distance. "I know I have no right to be here, no right to ask anything of either of you. But I could not bear the not knowing." Martha descended the porch steps with measured grace, stopping a few feet from Winona. The two women faced each other in the moonlight, so different in appearance and temperament, yet bound together by their love for the same man. "You have every right to seek answers," Martha said, and there was no hostility in her tone. "You loved him first, and from what I understand, you never stopped loving him even when duty forced you apart. I cannot fault you for that, even if I wish circumstances were different." Winona's eyes widened slightly, clearly surprised by Martha's composure. "You are not what I expected," she admitted. "When I learned he had married, I imagined a woman who would fight to keep him, who would see me as an enemy to be driven away. Instead, you speak to me with kindness when you have every reason to hate me." "Hate serves no purpose here," Martha replied simply. "It will not change the past or make the future any clearer. What we need now is honesty, not animosity." She turned to include Elijah in her gaze. "All three of us have been wounded by circumstances beyond our control. The question is whether we can find a way forward that does not cause more pain. Elijah moved to stand between them, feeling the weight of their expectations pressing down on his shoulders. "Martha is right," he said quietly. "We need to talk about this openly without pretense or evasion. Winona, you asked if there is hope for us. The truth is that I do not know. I love you. I have never stopped loving you. But I also made vows to Martha, and those vows meant something even if I did not always honor them as I should have. And I," Martha interjected, "need to know what kind of life I am facing. If you choose her, Elijah, I will not stand in your way. I have too much pride to cling to a man who wishes he were elsewhere. But if you choose me, if you decide to honor our marriage, then I need to know that you are truly choosing me and not simply settling for what is available because the alternative is too complicated." The ultimatum hung in the air, stark and uncompromising. Elijah looked from one woman to the other, seeing in their faces the same desperate need for resolution that churned in his own chest. How could he possibly choose between them? How could anyone be expected to make such a decision? "Perhaps the choice is not yours alone to make," Winona said slowly, her gaze fixed on Martha. "You have shown me more grace tonight than I had any right to expect. I came here prepared to fight for him, to do whatever was necessary to reclaim what I lost 10 years ago. But seeing the dignity with which you face this impossible situation, I find my certainty wavering." Martha tilted her head slightly, studying Winona with renewed interest. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I have already taken so much from you," Winona replied, her voice heavy with emotion. 10 years ago, I left and broke his heart, and you were the one who helped him put the pieces back together. You gave him a home when I could not, stability when I offered only memories. Perhaps I do not have the right to ask for more than I have already taken." The words seemed to cost her something, each one pulled from deep within her chest. Elijah watched her face, seeing the struggle playing out behind her dark eyes. This was not the Winona he remembered, the fierce young woman who had loved him with such passionate certainty. This was a woman who had been shaped by loss and duty, who had learned that love alone was not always enough to overcome the obstacles life placed in its path. "You would give him up?" Martha asked, her voice carrying a note of disbelief. "After everything you have been through to find him again?" "I would give him the chance to choose freely," Winona replied, "without guilt, without obligation to a past that can never be recaptured." She turned to face Elijah directly, and he saw tears glistening on her cheeks. "I love you. That has not changed, and it never will. But I have already spent 10 years living with the consequences of choices made for me by others. I will not be the cause of such choices for someone else. If you want me, if you truly want to build a life with me, then it must be because that is what you choose, not because you feel bound by promises we made when we were young and did not understand how complicated the world could be." The nobility of her words struck him like a physical blow. This was the woman he had fallen in love with, not just her beauty or her passion, but her integrity, her unwillingness to compromise her principles even when doing so might have gained her what she wanted. He remembered why he had asked her to marry him all those years ago, why he had been so certain that she was his destiny. And yet Martha stood before him as well, the woman who had accepted his broken heart and tried to heal it with patient devotion. The woman who had built a home with him, shared his bed, endured his distance without complaint. She had given him 3 years of her life, 3 years that she could never get back, and she had done it knowing that she would always be second in his heart. Both women were looking at him now, waiting for him to speak, waiting for him to make a choice that would determine all of their futures. The weight of it was almost unbearable. The knowledge that whatever he decided would cause pain to someone he cared about. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating, as Elijah struggled to find words adequate to the moment. The moon had risen higher now, bathing all three of them in its pale light, turning the scene into something almost otherworldly. Two women waited for him to decide their fates, and he had never felt more unworthy of the power they were granting him. "I cannot choose," he said finally, the admission torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "Not like this. Not standing here in the moonlight with both of you looking at me as if I hold the answers to questions I barely understand. I need time to think, to pray, to figure out what kind of man I want to be." It was a coward's response, and he knew it, but it was also honest, and honesty seemed to be the only currency that held any value in this impossible situation. Martha nodded slowly, as if she had expected nothing else. "Time is reasonable," she said quietly. "This is not a decision that should be made in haste." She turned to Winona, and something passed between the two women that Elijah could not quite interpret. "You should return to the boarding house," Martha continued. "Get some rest. Tomorrow will come soon enough, and with it the clarity that darkness often obscures." Winona hesitated, her eyes finding Elijah's one last time. "Whatever you decide," she said softly, "know that I will always love you. That has been the one constant in my life, the one truth that never wavered, even when everything else fell apart." She mounted her horse with the fluid grace he remembered from their youth and rode away without looking back. Elijah watched until she disappeared into the darkness, then turned to find Martha already walking back toward the house. He followed her inside, feeling like a stranger in his own home. The familiar surroundings seemed different somehow, charged with new meaning by the events of the day. Martha moved through the kitchen with practiced efficiency, banking the fire and setting out things for morning, all the small rituals of domestic life that had defined their marriage. "You should sleep in the spare room tonight," she said without turning around. "I think we both need space to think." It was the first time in 3 years of marriage that they would sleep apart, and the significance of it was not lost on either of them. Elijah nodded, though she could not see the gesture, and retreated to the small room at the back of the house that they usually reserved for guests. The bed was narrow and cold, the sheets smelling faintly of lavender from Martha's careful storage. He lay in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, his mind churning with images of both women. Winona, fierce and beautiful, offering him freedom while clearly hoping he would choose her. Martha, steady and dignified, asking only for honesty after years of accepting his emotional absence. How had his life become so complicated? 10 years ago, everything had seemed so simple. He loved Winona, she loved him, and they would build a future together on this unforgiving but beautiful land. Then she had left, and simplicity had shattered into 1,000 pieces that he had never quite managed to reassemble. Sleep came eventually, fitful and troubled, filled with dreams that tangled the past and present into knots he could not unravel. He saw Winona as she had been at 19, laughing beneath the cottonwood trees, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. He saw Martha on their wedding day, her gray eyes bright with hope that he now realized he had slowly extinguished over 3 years of emotional distance. He saw himself standing at a crossroads, 2 paths stretching before him into darkness, neither one revealing where it led. When morning came, gray and overcast, he rose feeling more exhausted than when he had laid down. Martha was already in the kitchen preparing breakfast with the same quiet efficiency she brought to everything. She did not speak as he entered, simply set a plate before him and retreated to her own chair at the opposite end of the table. They ate in silence, the distance between them feeling greater than the few feet of worn wooden surface. "I have been thinking," Martha said finally, setting down her fork with careful precision, "about what you said last night, about needing time. I want you to know that I meant what I said about not standing in your way if you choose her. But I also want you to understand what that choice would mean." He looked up, meeting her steady gaze. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if you leave this marriage, I will not simply disappear," she continued. "I have built a life here, made friends, established myself in this community. I will not abandon all of that because you decided your heart belongs elsewhere." There was steel in her voice now, a strength he had always sensed but rarely seen so openly displayed. "Whatever happens between us, I intend to remain in Cedar Hollow. You will see me at church, at the Mercantile, at every social gathering this town holds. Can you live with that? Can she?" The question forced him to consider practicalities he had not yet faced. Cedar Hollow was a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. If he left Martha for Winona, the scandal would follow all three of them for years. Every sideways glance, every whispered conversation would be a reminder of the choice he had made and the woman he had wounded. "I had not thought that far ahead," he admitted. "I have not thought about anything beyond the immediate impossibility of this situation." "Then perhaps it is time you started," Martha replied, rising from the table. "Love is not the only consideration in a matter like this. There are consequences, ripples that spread outward and touch lives beyond our own. Whatever you decide, make sure you are prepared to live with all of it, not just the parts that feel good." She left him sitting at the table, her words echoing in the empty kitchen. Elijah spent the morning wandering the ranch like a ghost, unable to focus on the work that usually anchored him. The cattle needed tending, fences needed mending. 100 small tasks demanded his attention, but his mind refused to settle on any of them. Instead, he found himself drifting toward the cottonwood grove by the river, drawn by memories he could not escape. The grove looked different in daylight, less magical and more mundane, just a cluster of trees by a slow-moving river. But the ghosts of his younger self and Winona still lingered here, their laughter echoing through the rustling leaves, their whispered promises hanging in the air like morning mist. He sat on the riverbank where he had asked her to marry him, watching the water flow past in its eternal journey toward the sea. How many hours had he spent in this exact spot over the past decade, mourning what he had lost, praying for her return? Now his prayers had been answered, and he discovered that the universe had a cruel sense of humor. It had given him back the woman he loved, but only after he had bound himself to another. The sound of footsteps on fallen leaves made him turn. He expected to see Martha or perhaps Winona come to press him for an answer he still did not have. Instead, he found himself facing Reverend Thomas, the elderly minister who had married him and Martha 3 years ago. The old man moved slowly, his joints stiff with age, but his eyes were sharp as they took in Elijah's hunched posture and troubled expression. "I heard about your visitor," the Reverend said, lowering himself onto a nearby log with a grunt of effort. "The whole town has heard, I imagine. News travels fast in Cedar Hollow." Elijah turned back to the river, not sure he wanted the conversation that was clearly coming. "Have you come to lecture me about the sanctity of marriage?" "I have come to listen," Reverend Thomas replied mildly. "You look like a man who could use someone to talk to." For a long moment, Elijah said nothing, watching the water ripple over stones worn smooth by centuries of patient erosion. Then, slowly at first, and then with gathering momentum, he began to speak. He told the Reverend everything, from his youthful love affair with Winona to her sudden departure, from his years of grief to his practical marriage to Martha, from Winona's unexpected return to the impossible choice that now lay before him. The old man listened without interruption, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. When Elijah finally fell silent, emptied of words, Reverend Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "You speak of this as a choice between two women," he said finally, "but it seems to me that the real choice is about what kind of man you want to be." "What do you mean?" Elijah asked, genuinely confused. "I mean that you have been defining yourself by your love for Winona for 10 years, the Reverend continued. "Even after you married Martha, even as you built a life with her, you held on to that identity as the man who lost his true love. Now Winona has returned, and you must decide whether you are still that man or whether you have become someone else. The observation struck Elijah with unexpected force. He had been so focused on the external dilemma, the choice between two women, that he had not considered the internal transformation it represented. Who was he now? The young man who had loved Winona with such passionate certainty seemed like a stranger, someone he had known once but could no longer fully recognize. The man who had married Martha, who had built a ranch and established himself in the community, felt more familiar but somehow incomplete. Marriage is not just a contract between two people, Reverend Thomas continued. It is a commitment to become something new, something that could not exist without the joining of two lives. When you married Martha, you made a promise to build that new thing with her. The question is whether you have honored that promise or merely gone through the motions while waiting for something else. I went through the motions, Elijah admitted, the words bitter on his tongue. I was a good husband in all the ways that could be measured, but my heart was never truly in it. Then perhaps that is what needs to change, the Reverend suggested gently. Not which woman you choose, but how you choose to love whoever you are with. Elijah looked at the old man, seeing the wisdom earned through decades of ministering to flawed human beings. What are you saying? I should stay with Martha out of obligation? I am saying that obligation and love are not opposites. The Reverend rose slowly, his joints creaking in protest. Many marriages begin with passion and fade into mere habit. But some marriages begin with duty and grow into something deeper, something more lasting than the fires of youth. The question you must ask yourself is not which woman you love more, but which love you are capable of nurturing into something that will sustain you through the long years ahead. He placed a gnarled hand on Elijah's shoulder. Winona represents your past, a beautiful dream that was interrupted before it could fully unfold. Martha represents your present, a reality that may lack the poetry of young love, but offers the prose of daily companionship. Neither choice is wrong, but they lead to very different futures. The Reverend began to walk away, then paused and turned back. One more thing, he said. Whatever you decide, make sure you can live with it in the quiet moments. The passionate declarations are easy. It is the ordinary Tuesday evenings that test the true strength of a marriage. Elijah sat by the river for hours after the Reverend left, turning the old man's words over in his mind. The sun traced its arc across the sky, shadows lengthening and shifting as afternoon gave way to evening. Somewhere in town, Winona waited for an answer. Back at the ranch, Martha carried on with the business of living, uncertain whether her life was about to change forever. And here by the river, in the place where his story with Winona had begun, Elijah finally began to understand what he needed to do. The choice had never really been about which woman he loved more. It was about who he wanted to become, what kind of man he could respect when he looked in the mirror each morning. The sun was setting when Elijah finally rose from the riverbank, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold that reminded him of the evening he had first told Winona he loved her. He had been so young then, so certain that love was simple, that wanting something badly enough could make it real. Now he understood that love was only the beginning, that what came after required choices made fresh every single day. He rode to town first, finding Winona sitting on the porch of the boarding house, her dark eyes tracking his approach with an intensity that made his heart ache. She rose as he dismounted, her hands clasped before her in a gesture of anxious anticipation. "You have decided," she said, a statement rather than a question. Her voice was steady, but he could see the trembling in her fingers, the fear she was trying so hard to hide. "Yes," he replied, stopping a few feet away from her. "I have spent all day thinking about what you said, about what Martha said, about who I am and who I want to become, and I realized something that I should have understood a long time ago." She waited, her dark eyes never leaving his face, bracing herself for whatever was to come. I realize that I have been living in the past, he continued slowly, choosing his words with care. For 10 years I have been the man who lost Winona, defining myself by an absence rather than by what was present in my life. Even after I married Martha, I held on to that identity because it felt safer than risking my heart again. Winona's expression flickered, hope and fear warring across her beautiful features. And now I understand that I have to let go of the man I was in order to become the man I need to be. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the turquoise beads, the ones he had carried for a decade as a talisman of their love. These have been my constant companions for 10 years, he said, holding them up so they caught the fading light. Every night I would touch them and remember what we had, what we lost. They became a way of keeping you close even when you were impossibly far away. Winona's eyes filled with tears as she recognized the beads she had given him so long ago. "Elijah," she whispered, but he held up his hand to stop her. "I need to give these back to you," he said gently. "Not because I am rejecting what they represent, but because I cannot carry them anymore. The weight of the past has been crushing me, preventing me from being fully present in my own life." Winona took the beads with trembling hands, clutching them to her chest as tears streamed down her cheeks. "You are choosing her," she said, her voice breaking on the words. "You are choosing Martha." He stepped closer, taking her hands in his despite the beads pressed between their palms. "I am choosing to honor the commitment I made," he said softly. "Not because I love you less, but because I finally understand that love is not enough by itself. Martha gave me 3 years of her life, stood by me when I was still grieving for you, accepted the broken pieces of my heart, and tried to make something whole from them. She deserves more than I have given her, and I cannot give her more while I am still holding on to you." Winona closed her eyes, and he watched as something shifted in her expression, pain giving way to a kind of peaceful acceptance. "I knew," she whispered. "When I saw her face yesterday, when I heard her speak with such dignity and grace, I knew in my heart that this was how it would end. I just needed to hear you say it." She opened her eyes, and through the tears, he saw something that surprised him: understanding. "You are a good man, Elijah Cole," she said quietly. "A better man than you were 10 years ago, I think. The woman you married is fortunate to have someone willing to fight for their future, instead of clinging to the past." He pulled her into an embrace then, holding her close one final time, breathing in the scent of sage and sweetgrass that would always remind him of his first love. When they separated, they were both crying, but there was a lightness between them that had not been there before. "What will you do now?" he asked, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I do not know," she admitted. "Perhaps I will stay in Cedar Hollow for a time. Perhaps I will return to my people. But wherever I go, I will carry the knowledge that you loved me truly, and that is more than many people ever have." She pressed the turquoise beads back into his hand. "Keep them," she said, "not as a chain to the past, but as a reminder that you are capable of great love. Let them remind you to give that love to your wife." He rode home as the stars emerged, the beads in his pocket feeling different now, lighter somehow, transformed from a burden into a blessing. Martha was waiting on the porch when he arrived, her face pale in the moonlight, her hands gripping the railing as if it were the only thing keeping her upright. He dismounted and walked toward her, seeing the fear in her eyes, the desperate hope she was trying to suppress. "I went to see Winona," he said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "I told her that I choose you. I choose our marriage. I choose to become the husband you deserve instead of the ghost I have been." Martha's composure finally broke, tears streaming down her face as she descended the steps and threw herself into his arms. He held her tightly, feeling her body shake with sobs of relief. and for the first time since their wedding day, he allowed himself to be fully present in the embrace. "I know I have wasted 3 years," he murmured into her hair. "I know I have hurt you in ways that may take years to heal, but if you will let me, I want to start again. I want to court you properly. Learn who you really are, build something real instead of something convenient." She pulled back to look at him, her gray eyes shining with tears and something else, something that looked like the beginning of hope. "I would like that," she whispered. "I would like that very much." Above them, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to the small dramas of human hearts. But here on the porch of their home, two people who had been strangers in their own marriage began the slow, patient work of truly finding each other. It would not be easy. The scars of the past would take time to heal. But as Elijah took Martha's hand and led her inside, he felt something he had not experienced in a decade. Peace. Not the peace of resignation, but the peace of choice, of commitment, of finally knowing exactly where he belonged.